So welcome everybody to webinar 3 of the CBME annual retreat. The first hour we're spending with a CBME expert panel, and we have a number of questions that we pulled forward from different discussions, and certainly webinar 2 when we got into discussions around competency committee trainee review and progression decision making and that. So we've rolled those questions forward for more discussion. But do feel free to pose any questions you wish into the chat. We're moderating that. You can also just raise your hand using the reactions button and let us know that you wish to speak or verbally ask a question. That's welcome too. We're trying to keep this really open, but I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Mike Parrish from anesthesiology. He's going to guide us through some of those questions, and our panelists will offer some answers to those questions. And if you have further questions from them or wish to discuss in more detail, please do. And we want to keep this really as open forum and really give great opportunity for those in different roles to ask their questions and have them fielded by a variety of different roles that are on the panel. So we have CBD Leads, program directors, program administrators, academic coaches, competency committee chairs, and CBD Leads from the office, and our Associate Dean, Dr. Parveen Wasi. So thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Lisa. Do we have a next slide to show our panel group of individuals? Perfect, thank you. So just to introduce myself, my name is Mike Parrish. I'm an anesthesiologist at Hamilton Health Sciences, and I am the Assistant Program Director for our residency program. I've been the Competency Chair, Competency Committee Chair for the last 2 years as well. I have been part of our CPD group since its inception. Anesthesiology actually went live with CPD 4 years ago. So us and ENT were the first programs to go through with CPD. So we are 4 years in, and we only have one more cohort left of the traditional program. Today, as Lisa had mentioned, this is just an open discussion, basically like a roundtable discussion about CPD. We'd like to keep this fairly open open discussion as much as the virtual platform can do for us. We have lots of individuals who have joined the session this afternoon. Lots of people who have expertise in the various aspects of CPD. I do have a list of questions which we can go through, but I was hoping that if anyone had any initial questions about CPD from either the webinar 1 or 2, or just questions that they may have on their own, if they would like to pose them now. If not, I have a whole list of different questions that we can go through. We talked a bit prior to us going live in this session that we would leave the MedSys information probably towards the end of the meeting. Chantal has joined us, so we'll have her join us, and she can answer any questions throughout the sessions. But if there's maybe technical questions around MedSys, maybe perhaps we can leave that towards the end of the session. And Lisa will moderate or look at the chat function as well if you have any questions you want to pose in the chat. So without further ado, does anyone have any questions that they would like to lead off with respect to CPD? If anyone wants to use their video functions, that would be a great help as well for discussion. Does anyone have any specific questions? Silence is golden. I can lead off with a question. We'll get the discussion going.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
Mike, sorry. Hi. Hello.
Hi, Raj. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Hi, Mike. I'm Raj Kamona. I'm the competency chair for rheumatology. Sorry, I was just fiddling there with my mic, so I wasn't sure if you could hear me.
Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I was able to attend the session last week, but I did attend the very. So apologies if you had already addressed this last week. So at the end of our competency committee meetings, I mean, so we usually fill out that report that then goes on to the REC. In terms of feeding that back to the residents, I usually just send an email. I don't send an official letter. I just send an email to the resident, just addressing any issues that needs to be covered for them to meet. If there's anything outstanding, if it's a promotional meeting, for example. Is there a need to send an official letter to the residents, or was just an email feedback sufficient?
That's a good point. Does anyone have any from our expert panel? I can let you know what we do, and if anyone in the panel has any advice as well. In anesthesiology, what we do is we create a competency committee report that actually gets populated from the discussions from the competency committee, and that is basically a letter discussing the progress of the resident, and that gets sent to the resident and the into their portfolio, as well as their academic advisor, once it's been ratified by the RPC. I think some programs have a fairly less comprehensive report or letter that's sent. Ours actually includes all of the EPAs that have been performed and completed up to that point in time. And it just gives a running total of what they've completed up to that point. We also do global daily evaluations, and they are tallied as well and summarized in that report. Does anyone else have any advice on that?
So I'm David Callan. I'm one of the pediatric neurologists. So my understanding, I think that it would just be, as long as it's documented, Raj, in some way, that you can show the Royal College that you've provided the resident with feedback, and whether or not you do that in an email or whether you do it in a formal templated letter, I don't think it would make a difference. I don't know if Parveen could speak to it, but I think as long as it's documented somewhere, I think it's fine.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, Raj.
Sorry,
I think it's actually better to have a templated letter. And the reason I say that is because I agree with what David said, as long as you have a document. The problem with emails is lack of standardization of information from one resident to another. You may concentrate on one particular thing on one resident, may concentrate on something different on another resident. What the templated letter is just standardizes the information that's going back to the resident. And I think standardization of decision-making of letters for residents always looks good from the perspective of the accreditation committee. We do have a lot of templates. It can be as fulsome as Mike has described. I mean, I think it also depends on the number of residents that are in the program and how often you're meeting, et cetera. But I actually would recommend a templated letter. So the exact same information is going to each resident. And then you have a narrative of specific areas for improvement for each resident. That would be my recommendation from the accreditation perspective.
Thanks, thanks for having. So to clarify, we do have a very comprehensive template. We had used a template that was put forward by the CBD program, and then I had modified that specifically for rheumatology. So it is it's really, really comprehensive, and we do complete that template each time we have a meeting. But my question was more towards like if there's any direct, more specific feedback, like if there's a single outstanding EPA, for example. In addition to sending that template, I also usually follow that up with an email to each resident saying, okay, this is what is specifically outstanding. This is what you need to attend to over the next couple of weeks before this particular phase is completed, for example. So in addition to the template, I generally send an email. I was just wondering if that email needs to be more formalized letter, or if just the template plus the email is.
I think that's totally fine. I just would ask why that information that's in the email can't be put in the template in terms of a narrative at the bottom of the is to-do list 1, 2, 3, so that you always have that to refer to, and that template, because the email will just go to you. It's just the problem with having two different things is just in terms of longitudinal follow-up as well, is that if you have a single template that goes into the file, I just wonder if you have a template that is very comprehensive, that information that they're missing an EPA, they need to do this, would that not be, and that actually takes a template that is relatively generic and really populates it with very specific information about that one resident. So it actually even looks better. That
Right.
I think you know, I think having both and having the email, if you're going to use emails, to make sure that you keep it in the resident file and it's there for everybody to see.
Right.
But I just wonder if there's any possibility of putting it into a single template. I just think that is better in the long run. Now, that's just my opinion. And that's just from being a surveyor and looking through things. Then I'm looking at a template and I'm looking at one piece of documentation that has everything. I'm not looking at a template, then turning it over and finding a specific email that relates to that. I just think it's cleaner. I'm talking from a survey perspective.
Right.
Yeah, in other words, all the information is contained in one document. In the chat box, Allison has put a link to the templates that are used for the Competence Committee reports. So if anyone's interested in that, you can take a look at the reports there.
There's a comment also from Reniel Sanadera. One thing to be mindful of is that you set an expectation that you'll follow up with it in this manner. It's critical to do this for all residents so everybody is treated equitably.
Absolutely.
Good input. Yeah.
So one of the questions that that is posed here is when looking at EPA assessments, do all the milestones need to be achieved or just the bolded ones in your EPAs? You'll probably be aware that within every EPA, there's multiple milestones. The specialty committees have identified which ones are the most important ones to achieve, and they are the bolded ones. In our program, we only include the bolded ones in our EPA assessments. I think if you included absolutely every one of them, it would be really mind-boggling, and you would have a very low threshold of people completing the forms. So we only have the bolded milestones included in the assessment forms for the EPAs. How about everyone else? Do you only have the bolded ones?
Yeah, in MedSys, it's only pulling in the bolded ones as well. So Royal College identifies that in their import file, and then that's what gets put into MedSys, and that's what's displayed on the evaluation forms.
Yeah. So the next question would be, so does every milestone have to be observed or completed for an individual to complete the EPA? How are people doing that?
So maybe I can speak. This came up in our discussion in the last workshop in one of the simulated cases or revised cases where there was a resident who had multiple EPAs that were completed with in all the appropriate contexts, but when you went down and you drilled down into the data, many of the intrinsic milestones actually hadn't been successful. And so it came up as, well, when one person is completing or evaluating one observation of an EPA, that you don't, and this is my understanding from the Royal College, is that you don't have to have observed all of the milestones in that EPA to give them an O score of 5. However, I think that one of the dangers with that is that if everyone doesn't observe the same milestone, then that milestone actually doesn't ever get observed. So this is something that I think that the competence committees themselves have to go back and review whether or not those milestones are actually being observed through different, I mean, the whole point when that diagram of showing the Swiss cheese and showing the various different holes, and hopefully we can actually by multiple assessments, look at the person as a whole. This is that same concept, making sure that multiple assessments don't miss the same milestones.
So just to share an observation in some of the competency committees I've participated in as an observer, when there's a particular issue around maybe one of the non-medical expert intrinsic roles, and you want to look down and unpack that EPA if there's difficulty and several attempts at the EPA and not progression to 5, and you unpack that EPA to look at the various milestones, they can become relevant there, some of the non-high yield, like the non-bolded ones. And there's always the ability to reassign the milestone back into the dashboard and leave it as pending if there's a particular issue on any of the intrinsic roles. So they have played out to be quite valuable in terms of rounding out the narrative and the EPA assessments.
Any other comments on the milestones? I would agree with, yeah, sorry, Raj, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think this was raised when we were first planning CBD, even before the program had launched, because we recognized that you can do the same EPA quite a few times, and you can miss some of those very intrinsic milestones. And our hope was that if you do sufficient EPAs, that eventually you would have covered all of the milestones. But I recognize that that could certainly be a gap. I mean, it would be great, and I don't know if Chantal can tell us this, if somehow we could have programmed this into MEDSIS, so that when you just look across that interface, you can actually see if there have been any milestones that have been consistently missed across the EPA evaluations.
So just to reply to that, there's a couple ways to look at the milestones. So if you actually click on any of the progress bars, the EPA progress bars on the EPA dashboard, there's a couple of graphs available, and one of them is a milestone graph, and it will show all of the milestones and how they've been assessed. So you'd easily be able to kind of find the holes there. The other option is to run a learner summary report. In the learner summary report, it will actually break down the EPA and all of the milestones and how the milestones have been assessed, and then it will have the collated comments underneath. So there's a couple of options to view them, but there's no kind of alert to say, for this EPA, maybe you want to look at, these particular milestones because they have not been assessed or have been assessed as not observed or something like that.
That's excellent. That's very good. If MEDSIS can provide that information, it's very good. One of the other questions we have is how many EPA assessments need to be completed before a trainee can begin the next stage? So I think this question is looking at, if you have an individual who, is coming up for promotion to the next stage, they have a couple EPAs that are left outstanding within a couple of the EPAs. How would a competency committee look at that individual? Would they allow them to proceed and be promoted? Or would they be kind of held back and require those outstanding EPAs to be done prior to going on to the next stage? Has anyone encountered this situation before, and how do people in your program deal with this situation?
So, I mean, with respect to just the number of EPAs, I mean, certainly that's determined by our specialty committee. In terms of outstanding EPAs, for example, for promotion, there have been a couple of times where, a resident might fall 2 observations short of accomplishing a particular EPA. And this is where very directed to that follow-up email, just to say that, okay, you've got these 2 outstanding, we are promoting you because, I mean, discussion and reviewing all of the documents, including ITIS and whatever other documents we have at hand. the resident was was progressing quite well, then we just have them complete those. We'll promote them, but then have the follow up with them to ensure that those 2 or 3 or whatever it is that were outstanding is completed in a timely manner, obviously.
This is Naveen Sidhu from the Pediatric Critical Care. I'm the program director. Our competency committee chair wasn't able to be here. We run into this issue a decent amount of the time. And I think as we're in our first, for us, from our specialty committee perspective, we're in our first iteration of EPAs. And I think that as time goes on, there'll be some changes. For a 2-year program, we have 31 EPAs. So with regard to how realistic it is as well for them to always complete them, that's something that's an ongoing discussion within the specialty committee. Well, the way we sort of take it is the fact that we see our competence committee as the gold standard for making the decision. So anytime there is an EPA that may not be completed to the exact number that needs to be, we try to take as much context into the situation, try to come up with sort of a consensus as a group whether we can still go ahead and promote them, and have come to points where we feel that we have enough information as a competence committee to be able to do that. It's a bit tough sometimes because we are a smaller program, so making sure that we're keeping and focused on the objective data and trying as much as possible not to supplement with sort of our own subjective information about the trainee. It helps to have an external member to help ground us so that we're not sort of heading off in sort of a biased direction. But really what we do is say that, there's different limitations, number of EPAs expected, whether it's realistic, COVID, and all sorts of other sort of various implications, and just sort of sit by the fact that the competence committee is the gold standard and do our best to come up with a good decision. Not perfect by any means.
Just to add to that, I think that what we know from going through the Royal College workshops is that, remember, all of these are guesstimates, right? I mean, we don't know how many times they're going to be able to do it, and so this is a CQI type process where things are going to get changed, and we've seen that in some of the earlier programs. And I don't know if Diane or Mike can speak to it in terms of whether or not any of the EPAs that were originally put together were then actually, whoa, we can't do this, and so we have to actually change it. So, and the only other thing to mention is just that remembering that certainly on an individual basis, they are able to attempt EPAs in later stages, even if they haven't progressed formally by the competence committee into the next stage yet. So they can always attempt later EPAs.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, in anesthesia, we are on our second version of EPAs. We had a large number that were kind of whittled down, but when they whittled them down, they actually expanded them. So there's more of them, there's less of them, but there's more to do within each one. And I think David's point is excellent in the fact that this is a guide. The Royal College, this is a guide, and we are, as competency committees, we are to make the assessment of the individual whether they are to be promoted or not. We've been in the same situation as Naveen with critical care, pediatric critical care, in the fact that we have individuals coming to promotion and there's a few outstanding EPAs. We do allow the individual to proceed and to be promoted. Under the stipulation that those EPAs that were still outstanding will be completed at some point. My only experience so far with that is I would recommend that you, number one, make sure that the individual who has outstanding EPAs has the ability to complete them in later rotations. If they have rotations which those EPAs aren't applicable, then obviously they're not going to have that clinical experience to be able to complete them. Secondly, I'd recommend putting a bit of a timeline with respect to when those outstanding EPAs need to be completed, so that they don't continue to be outstanding for a significant period of time. Those would be my recommendations. One of the Royal College webinars that I attended this year on CPD recommended that competency committees can promote individuals with outstanding EPAs, and they don't necessarily have to complete those EPAs as long as there's adequate documentation within the competency committee notes stating that the resident has demonstrated those skills and competencies in other areas of their training. I think if we do that as a competency committee, it just has to be really well documented for accreditation purposes. Anyone else have anything to add? I see Diane. Diane Reed is on the line. She's the program director who's had the most experience with CPD, even though she's a former program director now.
Well, I missed a bit the beginning. I'm sorry, I was in the operating room. So I believe that the question was, what do we do if a resident has some outstanding EPAs?
Yeah.
And they're close to promotion? Yeah, okay. Oh yeah, we have seen that. It's not unusual. What happens is, I mean, you're going to look at, you know, which EPAs, what's missing. Sometimes it's just maybe a couple observations here and there. Sometimes also we notice is the exposure. Either they didn't have the chance to have sufficient exposure to especially like a procedure, and those, residents can't really control that, and we can't control that either. What comes into the operating room. So what we did is we felt that the bulk of their EPAs were achieved, and there was only a few things here and there. We would do what's called a conditional promotion. And just like I've heard, we would put a timeline to say, okay, let's give you this timeline to complete what's missing. And if we need to tweak a little bit their rotation, change here, maybe a couple of weeks in a different spot, different OR. So we would try to do our best to accommodate it. And I think the important thing also is if you put the timeline, it's very important that you verify at that time. Because I mean, whatever you say, whatever you are proposing, you should back it up by making sure that you are going to do a follow-up on that timeline. And well, we have the academic advisors. So the academic advisors, we find that they're quite useful because they can follow closely the resident, like almost like on a weekly basis if we need to, and make sure that, they're working on what's missing. And I do agree with, keeping a very good documentation. And I believe that a competence committee can also decide that even if you're missing one observation, that we are going to grant that EPA, and even down the road, maybe not even ask them to go ahead and complete that one observation that's missing, especially if all the other observations, showed some very, very strong feedback. So it's pliable. I think there's some flexibility on what we can do. And because we're a group in the competence committee, it's not like a sole decision, like it's not just the chair. Everybody votes on it. And I think that works well. It's a little bit what we were doing also at the RPC level, right? We all had either a small committee for review of the residents with their assessments and all that. It's very similar. It's just now we just call it competence committee, and we're looking at EPAs plus all the other type of assessment that we used to do.
Perfect. Thanks, Diane. I'm just following up on the chat. I don't want to lose this conversation, but there has been a couple issues in the chat with respect to when decisions from the competency committee is taken to the RPC for ratification. The question is there not a confidentiality issue if residents sitting on the RPC review the information presented of their colleagues from the competency committee? I think everyone deals with this issue a little bit differently. In our experience in anesthesiology, we actually we bring the competency committee decisions to the RPC. We definitely have resident representation from every year on our RPC. We speak in generalities. There have yet to be any situations where we have had to speak about an individual in detail with respect to not meeting promotions. So that's been a fairly easy thing for us to do. But if we were in a situation where there had to be frank conversations with respect to an individual's promotion, we would probably have the resident representatives leave the room and have a private conversation with the faculty on the RPC. There is from Mac Peds Neuro a comment to answer the question about residents sitting on the RPC and getting the presentation of their colleagues. This needs to be transparent. If the residents are in agreement with the process, then it is fine to have a resident representative there. If the residents don't want the resident to be present, then some RPCs will ask the resident reps to step out when the Competency Committee data is being presented or that the data is anonymized. How do people feel about that? Does anyone have any issues or concerns about bringing forward Competency Committee decisions to the RPC?
I can share actually from our program. I'm Ines El-Gohari, I'm a unitologist. We haven't launched yet we haven't launched CBME yet in our program, but we do have now a very functional competency committee. In our program, I actually surveyed our fellows and residents, and both the two fellows who are sitting on the RPC committee and most of the other fellows, they chose not to have the residents or fellows actually involved in the ratification or sitting on the competency committee. For some reason, they prefer the confidentiality of the assessment being discussed and so forth. So that's kind of what we decided to do, which brings me to the next question that I have. So one of the issues that we have is that we would have our competency committee, but then we set kind of an excellence parameter that within 48 hours of the competency committee meeting, we would like all the letters to be ratified and kind of sent to the residents and their academic coaches. But the difficulty that we have is that sometimes the gap between the competency committee meeting and the RPC committee meeting. So the way we address that, or what we're doing right now, which I would like to consult with everybody if that's really the right way, is that we seek 2 of the RPC committee members who do not sit on the competency committee, and we review everything with them. So it's me as a program director and the competency committee chair and our program admin. We present all like the files and the decisions, and then we get them ratified that way. I don't know if this is the right thing or not, but the rest of the RPC committee are really members who are sitting also on the competency committee, which probably the issue for most of the small to medium programs. But I just wanted to get some feedback on that.
Inez, Naveen from Critical Care, we do something very similar because the way the timing would work, if we waited until an RPC meeting to ratify the decision from the Competence Committee, there would be a significant lag time. That isn't necessary because it's almost the same committee. There's a difference of maybe 2 to 2. So what we ask is that for ratification to occur, I'm blanking on the number of how many RPC members, I think we've decided on 3 or 4 RPC members to ensure that they sign off, and one of whom has to be a member of RPC that's not already a member of the Competence Committee. We don't necessarily sit and present it to them personally face to face, but what we do is we provide the letters that have been drafted to those RPC members. They just sign off on it if they agree, and if they don't, they can refer back to us if they have any concerns or questions. And then after that, as program director, I meet with all the trainees to go over the results. With regard to the confidentiality piece, I think, similar to what everyone else is saying, we asked our trainees in advance whether they wanted to be a member of the Competence Committee, and they all chose that they preferred the confidentiality of not having their peers be on that group. And so for that reason, when we do still discuss RPC ratification decisions as a standing agenda item, regardless, even if it's already been ratified, but just so we're all on the same page. And we do that at the very end of each RPC meeting so that the trainees can leave, the trainee reps on the RPC can leave so that we can continue on those conversations as needed. And that's based on what the fellows preferred. We talked a little bit about how, it allows their peers to advocate on their behalf, perhaps, but they all prefer the confidentiality. We have a very small group of just a few fellows, and that's the way they preferred it. So we defer to them on that.
Excellent. Now, I think it does really depend on the size of your program. One of the statements that I really took to heart from the Royal College is that it is important that once the Competency Committee makes decisions, that they are ratified by the RPC fairly quickly, so that information can be disseminated back to the residents. So I think most programs would find hopefully creative ways to do that. Sometimes it may depend upon how frequently your RPC is meeting. We meet every month, so it's fairly easy for us to have ratification of our decisions at the RPC.
Mike, one of the things when this came up, right at the beginning is what we thought was that similar to accreditation, where you get a program recommendation and then it has to be ratified at the AC, which is like 6 months later, is that if there is going to be a real problem in terms of timing, is that the Competence Committee report actually is a recommendation draft that actually goes to the resident. And there is actually a disclaimer on the top that these are the recommendations of the Competence Committee. This will be reviewed at the Residency Program Committee on such and such date, and a follow-up letter will, so that the residents have the information. And the only issue with that is if there's a substantive change, which usually isn't the case, but that way you can get the letters out and then ratify it at the Residency Education Committee. Many of the Residency Education committees, especially, as you said, depending on the size of the program, are meeting every 3 to 4 months. So they have 4 times a year. So it's very difficult to keep that up. So that is a potential solution to get it out fast, but to clearly have a disclaimer that these are recommendations of the Competence Committee and will need to be ratified.
Perfect. That's a great solution for those programs that have a fairly significant delay between Competency Committee decisions and the next RPC. That's great.
I think the only issue with this, Parveen, I think it's a great idea. It's just the only issue that I see if the recommendation is actually going on an EEP plan or a remediation plan, for example, then when do you start that time of notification to the resident? When do you start the plan? It becomes a little bit challenging, and there will be a time lag that can be important for moving that resident or fellow forward.
Oh, that's totally fair. In those specific cases, you could basically just, you're going to have to maybe call the Education Committee a bit sooner. Just in regular cases, you may just want to send the recommendation letter out. But you're totally right. It's going to be difficult to enact a other than regular educational plan without the residency RC yet. Obviously, I think what you guys have all suggested is great, as long as I would say that the residents just need to be aware that this is a process. That's the most important thing, is that if you only have 2 members that are going to ratify it, that it needs to be clear that that is the process, so that the residents are fully aware what the time frame and what the approval process is. One of the things that has come up quite a bit in the internal review process that we've gone through is that residents are not sure, number one, how decisions are being made, and number 2, who's making them and who's actually approving them. And so I think a letter to the residents in terms of, the Competence Committee, who's on it, who's there, what's the decision-making process, that should go out from every single program. The Royal College has a template for residents, and you just can use that template and just populate it with your own program. as a guide to residents. So anybody who's entering, it should be a guide to residents, and it should be distributed every year as new residents come on. Same with in terms of trying to figure out whether a resident should sit on the RPC for resident, that survey needs to be done every year if we're going to do a survey, because the residents will change over every year. So I'm just talking in terms of what the feedback from residents have been through internal reviews. That has probably been quite a common complaint from residents, that they don't know the process.
And one of the things that we did, and our residents and fellows found it helpful, because I had a town hall with them about competency committee, myself and the competence committee chair. We circulated information. They attended a session about it. They still had a lot of questions. We actually, after taking sort of like a permission from the competency committee chair and the members, we invited the chiefs to attend the discussion in the competency committee about themselves. And then they took that experience back to the residents and fellows, and they found it helpful. So that's one of the things we.
I do wonder if somebody has a standard templated letter that they send out to the residents about the competence committee, who's on it, what is the assessment data that's going to be used, what's the time frame, what's the process. If somebody actually already does that as a thing, it would be great for us to actually get that as a template. And again, we can put up the Royal College. That's just a memorandum to residents, but it's actually very well put out. And if you change it into a Word document, you can actually take the generic stuff and make it very specific to your program. And that can be sent to residents to say, this is what we're doing, so that residents are fully aware of what the process is. So if anybody has that, if you can forward to Lisa and what is a standard resident letter that goes out regarding the competence process, that would be really helpful, I think.
Those are excellent suggestions. I find that sometimes our competency committee meetings aren't even, like, the residents aren't notified that they're happening. And I wonder if that's something that we should be doing as well. I see the competency committee as more of a committee in the background. And I find if I was to announce when our next meeting was and who was going to be discussed, I didn't want to increase the anxiety of the residents. And I find the competency committee is a bit of a work engine in the background that's doing its thing, that it's not necessarily something that needs to be announced to the residents that there's a meeting coming up. However, I do find the exact words that Parveen said very interesting, in the fact that they really do need to know the process, and it needs to be transparent with that. Joanne, did you have you're on mute.
Thank you. We actually send an email out to the residents a few weeks before each competence committee meeting, because we realized that, of course, our PGY ones had no idea what we were talking about. And so then realized we should send it out to everyone, but that way as well, it's a reminder to them that if they have any outstanding evaluations or things that they're almost done, to get them in. And then when the letter comes to them, it also doesn't come as a surprise that their progress had been reviewed. And it saves questions later. So that is something that we've started to do. And I haven't found or heard that it's increased their anxiety. I've also, though, tried to be quite transparent with them in saying, if I think a concern is going to be raised at the competence committee, you and I will have already talked about it. So hopefully that helps with the anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So in rheumatology, we do pretty much the same thing. About a couple of weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks prior to our meetings, I do inform the residents, especially residents who have outstanding EPAs. So I inform them ahead of time. In addition to that, they are well aware of when our committee meets. We have a list of meeting dates, and we have a shared Google Drive that the residents access for all of that common information.
That's very good. One of the questions in the chat asked the question of whether we have resident representation on our competency committees. And if so, is that an individual, an internal or an external resident? Our program does not have any resident representation on our Competency Committee membership. We do have two external individuals. One is a former program director, and another is an individual who is a medical education scientist. And we find having external members very, very good. One person mentioned already, it kind of grounds the committee and brings them back to, it allows you to be reflective upon your own process when you have individuals there that aren't necessarily in your own department. So we found that very, very, very effective. How about other people? Do you have resident representation or any other faculty representation?
Yeah, maybe I could just share what we do in general surgery, because I get the sense that it perhaps is not common with a lot of these other programs. So, and I've been finding this discussion very interesting. So I've sat on the RPC for general surgery for about 7+ years now, and chair the Competence Committee just since we implemented in July. And we have resident representation on both. So we have one of our PGY5s as a representative on the Competence Committee, and we asked that group to nominate one among them. And of course, like most other programs, we have one resident rep from each year on our RPC. And we, in fact, I'm not the program, Dr. Marcash is the program director, and in fact, we've had residents, all the resident reps at the RPC present for in-camera sessions where we discuss struggling residents who are in trouble. And I think the philosophy has always been, chatting with Mike Marcaccio, is that that it's one of the sort of competencies, if you will, that we have residents learn to grapple with colleagues and issues of professionalism. And it's an issue of professionalism for them to be able to grapple with that in a good way, to maintain confidentiality and all that stuff, right? And but I gather that that's not obviously shared among all the programs. So I've been finding this discussion pretty interesting, but so far it hasn't really caused an issue from what I've observed, but I can see certainly that there are potential drawbacks that we're always vigilant for. So.
Have you had to discuss a struggling resident yet?
At the Competence Committee?
Yeah.
Yes, we have.
Oh.
And, again, so far it hasn't posed a major issue, but certainly we're very vigilant about that. And but certainly where appropriate, the understanding is that we would recuse the resident representative when it's deemed appropriate.
Yeah.
To do so. So.
How about other programs? Do any other programs have resident representation on their competency committees?
It's something we do.
We
we actually had a fairly lengthy discussion with the residents, and we actually asked them to vote if they would want a resident rep, and they said yes. So we use our elected rec reps actually to sit on the Competence Committee. And when they're doing the elections for the resident reps, that's actually made very clear that those residents will also be representing the residents on the committee. We have discussed residents where there are concerns. And the other person that we have is we actually have a non-MD faculty member as well.
How about
we have a small program. We have a small program, right? We have 10 or 11 residents, and no, we don't have any residents on the Competence Committee. We do have 2 external. One is a faculty who is a surgeon in a different specialty, and then we have also Renee who's on the Competence Committee. If we have a resident that is maybe struggling, that needs to have either an educational plan or remediation, and they know that they're going to be discussed, well, we invite them if they want to come, and we also tell them if they want to bring a resident with them, they're allowed to, and it does not need to be a resident from our own program. But so far, it's never happened that they wanted to be there or have another resident.
Thanks, Diane. we only have a few minutes left. So as a moderator, I'd like to make that known that we only have about 7-8 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to raise to the group, we only really got through just a really tip of the iceberg in terms of the number of questions. However, the discussion has been very fruitful and interesting. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask before we wrap up this part of our session?
I have a question. For those that do have an academic coach or advisor, do you use a tool like template for your advisor to prepare a report? So far this year, this is the first time. We have 10 residents. Well, actually we have 11. And we are 10 faculty. So everybody within our faculty is an advisor. So it is, you know, a bit of a challenge in the sense that when you're starting to be an advisor for the first time, you know, oh, what do I need to do? And they're not sure. So we have a bit of a guideline that helps them, like a term of reference on what is their role. And we also had a template that they use to fill out all of the type of assessment that they need to review, the EPAs. And we find that it is helpful, and it kind of speeds up a bit the process when they come to the committee. And we actually have our advisors come and present their residents. It's a bit of a challenge in terms of organizing that meeting, but since Zoom, that's been fantastic. I think everybody was able to come, you know, through Zoom to present their review of their learner. So I just wanted to know, what does most programs do if they have an advisor? And is it the advisor who presents at the committee?
So Diane, maybe I can just speak to that. So I'm the competence chair for the core PEDS program. And one of the issues in the past was that it was kind of left up to the academic coach to put together a summary of the resident. And what we found was that we ended up chasing down all these coaches to say, hey, you haven't got your summary in. And then we'd come to the competence committee and we wouldn't have the data on that resident. And it just kind of didn't work very well, because it was like herding a bunch of cats. And I mean, I'm not saying that the PED staff are challenging. I think it's just the nature of the beast. And so we ended up centralizing it so that it was done almost like the MD program does. So I don't know if you've had a medical student that you've followed through time, but periodically you'll get something sent out from the MD office that has a summary of everything put together. And basically the academic coaches are now just supposed to kind of walk through that document with the resident and then put a little summary of what they think is going on. And that's much more doable rather than them doing the administrative portion. And so that's been our experience, that getting them to do the admin stuff didn't work very well. Now, they didn't present at the competence committee, so maybe it makes a difference if your academic coaches are the ones bringing the resident forward. I don't know.
So David, we found the same thing in our competence committee, and we've developed a form, and I think we've revised it a couple of times, but you're right, it actually it allows for a standardized version of presentation for the primary reviewer and instructs the coach, especially the new coaches, because every year we're getting new coaches, as to what's required at their meeting. We also have a resident reflection form that has to be filled out as well. So I'm sure you would be happy to share it. I'd be happy to share ours as well if anyone's interested.
We do a similar type thing in anesthesia, where we have a competency committee report. We're currently on Google Docs, so we share the document with the academic coach or the advisor and the secondary reviewer. So they actually self-populate that report before the Competence Committee meeting happens. And they don't actually have to come and present their resident. All the reports are done prior to the meeting, and the Competence Committee members review all the reports. Within that report, it has the primary reviewer, which is the academic advisor, and a secondary reviewer from the Competence Committee. We find that works very well. It's very time efficient and doesn't delay things at the meetings, because all the reports are basically done prior to the meeting. At the end of the meetings, I basically complete the form by a summary at the bottom, and that actually is the Competence Committee report that's generated from that meeting. So it's actually very helpful. So is there any last words anyone has? We only have a minute left, and we're trying to keep on time to keep everyone's, we're all very busy. This has been a very, very good discussion. And as I mentioned, it's only been, we only had a snippet of questions presented to the group and had some excellent discussion. I think we can only build upon this and expand and learn from each other as time goes on. There was talk before this meeting happened that the faculty development subcommittee would take the information within this meeting and start to build a frequently asked questions CPD report almost that would be put on the website for individuals to review. And I think that that's an excellent start to this and to build upon for our discussions in the future.
Thanks. So that's the end of our first hour. Hopefully everybody's staying tuned, and some more join for our next hour, which is going to be program presentations. So we're sharing success stories, innovations in CBD, CBME, and some active scholarly work. We have a number of different program presenters that are just going to get ready. Allison's going to prepare the slides for presentation. So if you want a couple minutes for a quick break, this would be the time. So let's carry on. I'm sure we can pack the next hour with great presentations and good discussion. So Parveen, if you would like to introduce our speakers and get us started.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks for everybody to be on this call on a Friday afternoon, and actually on a very beautiful day on a Friday afternoon. So thank you. Thank you to our presenters for this afternoon. The first one is Dr. Val Mueller, and Valerie was the program director for obstetrics and gynecology and is currently the associate chair education. And her topic is going to be the implementation of EPAs in an OB-GYN residency program case study. Welcome, Valerie, and thank you.
Thanks, Parveen. Bear with me, everyone. I've got this nasty cold going on, so I'm hoping I can get through okay. Next slide, please. So as most of you know, we've all been implementing CBD. So for us in OB-GYN, our residents work through surgical foundations in their first 1 to 2 years. And surgical foundations launched in 2018, and then OB-GYN launched in 2019. And as I'm sure most of you know, there's lots of literature supporting CBME, but there's not a lot of literature exploring the implementation of some of the new assessment tools, specifically the use of EPAs. Next slide, please. So this is a study of the implementation of EPAs, and really a look at how EPAs are used within our OB-GYN residency program here at McMaster. So it's a mixed method study. Part 1 was quantitative analysis. So really we looked at EPA assessment data for our PGY1 and PGY2 level residents. And as well, we looked at faculty completion rates. And then part 2 was our qualitative analysis, and we performed semi-structured interviews of our faculty and the residents whose data we looked at, who by the time we did the focus groups were now PGY2 and PGY3s. And then we used general grounded theory techniques to analyze the focus group data. So in terms of our results, we collected data for 13 residents. So we had 7 PGY1s and 6 PGY2s. The average number of EPA assessments completed for each resident was about 127 per year. And this is looking at our residents and our EPA score distribution, with them both for each resident being highlighted in yellow. And so what we take away from this is that our residents seem to be not using EPA assessments for feedback and development, but rather are using them for assessment purposes, hence the modes being mostly in the 4 to 5 range. Sorry. If we look at faculty completion of EPAs, we had a total of 184 faculty members who completed EPA assessments across 7 sites, so 3 community sites and 4 academic sites. You can see that the majority completed less than or equal to 5 EPAs. If we look at the community sites versus Hamilton sites, we see that the completion rate in Hamilton was higher at 80% with an expired rate of 18%, versus a completion rate in the community of 63% and an expired rate of 35%. Looking at our focus groups, we had 7 faculty members participate, 3 from our community sites and 4 from the Hamilton sites. And we had 4 residents, 3 current PGY3s and 1 current PGY2. The major themes that came out of the focus group analysis were these 3. So resident stress, treating EPA completion like a checklist, and improvement over time. And just to delve into those a little bit deeper. So for resident stress, there's a couple of quotes here. So from a resident, part of the pitch was it's supposed to reduce the evaluation fatigue. It's supposed to lead to really meaningful evaluations on small tasks, but I feel like all it's done for me is increase evaluation fatigue. I feel like we're constantly supposed to be thinking about these, and then retrospectively, I'm like, oh shoot, I should have thought to do an EPA. And the other quote from another resident, I think the sheer volume of them is one of the biggest issues. There's just so many, and it's hard to know when to get them and at what point you should be completing them. So that's a bit challenging. It gets better, but it's still challenging. Sorry. Treating EPAs like a checklist from one of the residents. I have a list of the ones that I need to get, and I have them on a note on my phone. And then I'm like, okay, what EPA can I vaguely say I did today so that I can just get these done? You're not getting any useful feedback from the EPA. It's just a logistical task that I have to get done at the end of the shift. The other comment from a faculty member, I think the idea that they do have a list of things that they're trying to tick off, and any little involvement in a case, if they can tick that off, they will, which is kind of like the motivation is not that genuine. And then lastly, improvement over time from a resident. I think having them be able to be completed on our phones or on our computers has been good. They just recently changed it so that the evaluator can directly submit from your computer or phone, and they don't need to get a separate email. So that's been really helpful. And from another resident, the experience has become a lot more positive just because it's something that's more common and something that people are just more comfortable with. So our conclusions are that for residents in OB-GYN, EPA assessment completion is resident driven and used for evaluation or assessment purposes rather than being used for feedback and learning. EPA completion causes significant stress amongst the residents, and despite the challenges, the processes for EPA assessment completion are improving. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Val. That was really, that was great, actually. I think if you look at the chat that's been happening while you were speaking, I think a lot of directors have actually gotten the same experience. So number one, in terms of, you know, residents really just wanting to complete it and waiting till they're ready and they're sure they're going to get a 4 or a 5. The other big issue is, you know, culture and disturbing the faculty, et cetera, is that, did you have any idea from the triggering process from your study is how often, was it almost 100% triggered by residents versus faculty? Could you get that data?
Yes, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it's over 90% resident.
Right. Anybody have any, just in the interest of time, maybe we could, one question for Val? Well, I think, thank you, Val, for actually ending on hope. That was actually nice.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. We're going to just move on to the next one. If I can just ask people, maybe just if you have something to chat about, we could wait till the end of the presentation, because it sometimes is a bit distracting from the presentation. And then it would be better if we just open it up to the whole group, if people are agreeable with that. Our next one is Ailen Yang, and he is the Competence Committee Chair for General Surgery, and he's going to talk about his end of rotation assessment form.
Okay, great. Thank you for this opportunity to share. So this is the form that we started to use in our program, General Surgery, as of July 1st, coinciding with when we implemented CBD. We did not want to continue having an IDER, the traditional IDER, once CBD was implemented. So we arrived at this form. You can see the hope is that less is more. It's very simple. And this is just very recent that you can see this is in MEDSIS. So really grateful for the good people at MEDSIS and postgrad who worked to have this form implemented for us so it can be triggered and completed within MEDSIS. And this form is meant to be completed by each and every faculty with whom the resident has worked on a given rotation at the end of the rotation. So you can see it's very, very reminiscent of the narrative portion that you'll find at the bottom of traditional IDERs. And you can see the wording that we use there. So we ask the assessor to comment on the strengths demonstrated. We prompt them to provide specific and actionable feedback about areas for improvement. And we have a space there for them to put in other comments about the performance. And that's it. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. The rationale for it really is as you can see there. So as of July 1st, as we mentioned, we implemented CBD, and as Val mentioned, and many programs I'm sure share this, the vast majority of the EPAs are triggered mainly by residents, maybe a few occasionally by very enthusiastic and engaged faculty. We've done our best to encourage that and stuff, but we wanted something that can be guaranteed to be completed at the end of the rotation so that we at the Competence Committee can get a sense of how a resident performs on every rotation. But our program's got 41 residents and 20 some odd faculty. And as we all know, some faculty is more engaged than others. And we have these 41 residents, all of whom, as an aside, we've chosen to have them all access EPAs as we do for the official Royal College CBD PGY1s. So we've modified the criteria in terms of how many of the other PGYs have to do, but we're rolling it out for everyone. So we recognized pretty early on that faculty assessment fatigue is going to be a big issue, and we didn't want to have faculty to have to check off pages of Likert scales in the traditional IDER. So what we did was we took them all away, and we leveraged the fact that the CAM-MES roles are baked into the milestones found in the EPA observations. And the hope is that by getting the faculty kind of directly into the narrative comments portion, that they would be fresher, they'd be more inclined to provide more fulsome feedback. And when we talk to residents, even with the IDERs, it's always been the narrative comments at the bottom that they find the most useful, and hopefully perhaps more useful for our Competence Committee as well. So And I think having a kind of a brief form also makes it more feasible to ask every faculty to complete one of these at the end of the rotation. You know, for several years in general surgery, I think other programs have done this too. I've seen this where you would have kind of a group assessment set up so that just one faculty member does an ITER on behalf of all the faculty on the rotation. But we found problems with that, and residents have fed back to us problems with that too, right? Residents, they rarely have a uniform experience with all the faculty on a rotation, and residents have told us that they want feedback from every faculty that they work with. And you can imagine too that feedback often gets filtered through the lens of that one faculty member. So for all those reasons, having this kind of briefer form kind of allows us to have something directly from each faculty, and things that are truly themes can hopefully be more accurately represented as truly themes, right? When you see a comment on a group evaluation, is that just from one faculty? Is that kind of a theme? Whereas if you have a assessment for every faculty member, then that becomes hopefully clear. It becomes more clear and more accurate. So if you could go on to the next slide. But certainly acknowledge that there are limitations to this. With simplicity comes less structure. So depending on what the faculty, who the faculty is doing, what they're inclined to provide in terms of feedback, that can be an issue. As well, like any other assessment that's delayed until the end of the rotation is susceptible to biases like recall bias. The feedback can become vague because it's farther away from perhaps some sentinel events that took place. And there are some rotations that will yield not a lot of EPAs, and therefore the specific feedback about certain CAMES roles may be very limited. So the hope is that if there are any major deficiencies or troubles or themes with certain intrinsic competencies, whether it's collaborator, things like that, that would come out in this form regardless, because the faculty would hopefully be inclined to provide that feedback. So, but certainly that is acknowledged limitation of this. But I think so far from what we've seen since its implementation, the feedback has been valuable coming from here. I think faculty really do get to this in kind of a fresher mindset, and they really did kind of anecdotally so far. It'd be interesting as time goes on and we get more accumulated evidence and assessment data to see whether it is on the whole more fulsome and useful. But I think so far it's been valuable for us. So that's all I have. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Island. Does anybody have any quick comment or a question? We can have 2 comments, 2 questions for Island.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Island. Sorry. Thank you for the presentation. It's Mike Parrish. 2 questions actually. So I'm wondering about the rate of return of your assessments with it being this way. And are these assessments available for the residents to view, or do they go to the Competency Committee specifically?
Yeah, so to the first question, the completion rate has been good because again, it's a brief assessment, and it's not perfect, but no, we've had most rotations that we've reviewed so far. There's 5 faculty on that rotation. You get 5, maybe 4 of them will fill it out. Again, it's not perfect. There are some faculty, as we all know, that can be a bit truant. They may not have completed all, but it's been good. And in terms of whether residents have access to them, yes, they do. We used to before, again, the efforts that METSIS and the people at METSIS and Postgrad have done to put it into METSIS, we had this done through Microsoft Forms, and we did have a way to collate them and for the residents to access them, just as they would once ITERs are completed, they would get them, and we would have made that available to them. But now that they're within METSIS, they'll be able to access them and get that feedback.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. So we're going to move on to Dr. Lori Whitehead, from Program Director for Internal Medicine, and she's going to talk about ITAR revision. Should we aim for a 1-page ITAR?
Thanks, Parveen. So Lisa asked if I would speak about the 1-page ITAR or ITAR revision, and actually we have about 25 or 30 ITARs in our program, and so I started to do some cropping. Actually, we started doing cropping 4 years ago when CBME was just going to be coming in preparation for, making it a little bit easier on the evaluators. So I cut our ITARs in half at that time. And then as we actually went right into CBME, I cut them again, but most of our ITERs are just down to about 1.25 pages. We haven't quite got to the 1 page. Then I got sidetracked with COVID and doing a virtual ITER, and I'm kind of glad I did because of the fact that I went to the literature, and now I've heard hearing stories from other people, like from our last 2 speakers, which I think this talk is quite complementary to theirs. Some of the themes that came through are consistent. So I'm glad I didn't go too far with it, because I think I would make different changes now that I've looked at the literature and talked to others. So what do we want from an ideal ITER, if we want to even keep an ITER? We want to look at, I think we've heard like from Val as well, we're more interested in assessment for learning than assessment of learning. And we know that there's gaps in EPAs. And so I think that the ideal ITER would allow us to make decisions as assessors on what our residents need and where they're going, and to provide meaningful feedback. It has to meet a standard of being reliable, valid, of high quality. We hope to have a high completion rate, and that's where the shortened ITER is going to help because of reader fatigue, which you've heard about and we've all experienced. Next slide. So there's 2 studies I briefly want to present to you. And I must say I haven't done any studies or assessment of any of the ITER chopping I've done, so I'm glad that there is some literature. There's not much, but there's some. So this study out of Alberta came across as an abstract, and I think it was a poster presentation at the ICRE in 2016. It was done in Alberta, and it wasn't really randomized, but they took medicine students, medicine residents, and half of them that were at 2 different sites used a shortened ITER, and the other half used the standard ITER. They went down from 35 to 14 items. They used an analysis looking at reliability and ITER formative quality. And for the ITER formative quality, they used a score called the Completed Clinical Evaluation Report Rating. And I have seen that used in the literature quite a bit when looking at assessment tools, especially ITERs. They found overall that reliability was maybe slightly less than what with a shortened ITER compared to the standard ITER, but they thought the quality was perhaps a bit better. So it's sort of like, well, it's okay to shorten it. It didn't really make too much difference. Maybe it's better overall, maybe it's not. So not any heavy conclusions there, but at least a signal that it's probably okay. Next slide, please. The second study is a more recent one out of McGill in 2020, and it was done in a larger group of undergraduate students looking at ITERs, and they used the concept of nudge therapy that they got from the business world. And that's rather than making a huge change, you kind of inch along with changes and then evaluate and then make further modifications and evaluate, which is actually a pretty good idea. So they had 2 separate nudges, and for each one they used as analysis the ANOVA scale. So they again looked at the CCERR score that they'd used in the last one to look at quality. Next slide, please. It's probably best in this table to show you what they did. So at baseline, before they did any nudges or changes, they had a 5-point score and 12 assessment variables on that. They had a comment narrative box that was placed at the end of their form, as we do now. And the number of comment boxes was just 1, and there were no instructions for it. They also had checklist items like whether or not they'd done a paracentesis or whether they'd given broken back bad news, which I haven't used in the past. So for the first intervention and the second, for both actually, they went to a pass-fail system. In other words, they decided to completely get rid of the rating scale and to completely get rid of those items on the rating scale. And so for nudge number 1, intervention number 1, the interesting thing that they did for both 1 and 2 is they put the narrative comment box right at the top of the form. And in the first intervention 1, they had 4 categories: keep doing, do more, do less, or stop doing. And in the first intervention, they went up on the checklist because they got rid of the things on the 5-point rating scale. They cranked up from 8 to 27 on the checklist. Then they did an evaluation. We'll look at that data in a second. Intervention number 2 remained as a pass-fail with no scoring system. Again, they left the narrative box right at the top, but they broke it down just into 2 boxes, one to specifically describe performance, which is sort of reminiscent of what Elon was saying with his form, and 1 box for recommendations. Again, sounds like general surgery. And what they did, they took the checklist down from 27 to 7. So next slide, please. So I just, of the 9 things, parameters on the CCERR rating scale, I just looked at the 5 or 6 that shows statistical significance. And you can see that between baseline and any intervention is where the improvements were seen. But on the yellow thing at the top, it actually went the wrong way. And that was where they took the checklist down and they took the rating scale off, went to pass fail, and got rid of the items that were on the checklist. And the assessors said that they had a little difficulty detecting strengths and weaknesses in the residents. So that one didn't really work out so well, but the rest of the things showed quite a good improvement. And overall, the ANOVA score for overall showed a slight improvement that reached statistical significance in terms of a better ITER score with the nudges. Next slide, please. So basically, yeah, I think we can move ahead because I think I've covered most of this, but they said overall the quality of the ITERs was quite low. The improvement was small. And the thing that seemed to be the best, as I mentioned, was the location of the comment boxes and directing those comments towards recommendations and performance indicators. As I mentioned, the shortened ITER, when they took away the rating scale, that wasn't great. So coming back to us and what I want to do with our program, after reading this and hearing from others, I think the nudge changes is a pretty good principle. I think it fits in with our CQI format that we're trying to do when we assess changes in education and new things that we put forth for our residents and for our faculty. I'm into the more narrative comments. I think we all agree with that. I think it's probably good to move that comment box. If I'm going to keep the ITER, I would like to move it up to the top of the form. And I like the two boxes similar to what general surgery has. And with a positive note, keep doing and do more, not do less of and not doing, which is a negative. I think I'll take our ITERs and squeeze them into a page down to about 10 items. And that composition of the items under the CanMeds domains will depend on what the objectives are for that rotation. And I think at this point, I'll keep the rating scale. We have found, and I think the rationale for me retaining the ITER at this point is because in our competence committees meetings, we have found several occasions where the EPAs have not at all represented or identified really quite significant gaps that we've seen in our residents that have shown up on the ITERs. Not only we can see some consistency in the check boxes within the CanMed domains and in the narrative comments. So I think this has informed me as to what I should do next. And I thought it might get everyone sort of stimulated to think about what they're going to do in their own program for assessment tools, specifically ITERs. Thank you.
Super, Lori, that's great. I think we're just going to move on to Diane, because actually Diane, it's a good segue, programmatic assessment without an ITER and how to get to a 5. And then maybe after that presentation, we'll just open it up for a little bit for discussion from the group. Go ahead, Diane.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, thank you for having me. I have no disclosure, so my outline, I'm just going to give a little background about our program, talk about summative assessment and formative assessment, the resident portfolio, and about getting to a score of 5, and then talk about the entrustment of global grading scale. Next slide. So I had mentioned a bit previously, our program is a small program. Currently, we have 11 residents, and our learners are based at HHS St. Joe's, and also they go in a community location. Among our 10 faculty, mostly are responsible of the education. They are actually doing a lot. Everybody is wearing a hat in different roles. And what is new since CBD is now that we've been CBD for 4 years, all of our faculty are actually now academic advisors. So this is a new thing for us. New slide. Next slide. So obviously when competence, sorry about that. So for the summative assessment, we know that the goal of those assessments is to evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some standards or benchmarks. It is also evaluating a resident's learning by comparing the resident against their goals and objectives of their rotation. And we do find in surgery that the summative evaluation do not really reflect the spectrum of their procedures that need evaluation in the operating room. Next slide. So obviously with competence by design, we do know that we are all aiming to the formative assessment, and it is an opportunity for change. If we compare the summative from the formative, the high stakes are the summative, low stakes formative. And what's important to know is that the EPAs are there to provide direct feedback to the residents. And we want to increase surgical feedback opportunities on the go, and that will be very important. And it has been improved over time. I would say that we have been doing this regularly in the past, but maybe not really thinking hard that we are actually providing that feedback in the operating room. Next slide. So I thought that I would talk about the resident portfolio. And the reason why I brought it up is that we are actually not using IDERs anymore. And then when you start looking at the resident portfolio, what comprised that portfolio in terms of the assessment tools, you can see that you have all the results of the EPAs, multi-source feedback, surgical log, all the results of their exam, some narrative feedback, their scores on their simulation, their self-reflection, their academic advisor report. So a lot is comprised within that portfolio. And then you kind of wonder, well, why do we need to add an item? So new slide. So some of them thought, kind of thought that maybe that portfolio and the IDERs would complement the intrinsic, there's non-medical expert role. And what we kind of thought is, if we take the IDER out, we have to make sure that we get all of the feedback, about communicator, collaborator, and scholarship and all that. And then if you really look at that portfolio, the ones that are enlightened in blue, they're really more like the medical expert. But if you look at all the other ones that I highlighted now in red, they all cover part of that soft can meds roles that we're looking for, that we were thinking that we could capture that on the IDER. But we're actually capturing it already with all of the other assessments. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to remove the IDER. So new slide. So IDER or no IDER in otolaryngology. So on July of 2017, we took the decision of not to use the IDERs. We did not want the residents relying on the end of the rotation of an IDER. Basically, what we wanted to do is to make sure that our residents are triggering their EPAs. We wanted to also avoid the burden of completing long IDERs. Faculty doesn't always remember the procedures if you are trying to assess a procedure on an IDER. So those were completely removed. It's too long and it takes too much time to fill out an IDER. It was always difficult to have this time face-to-face to fill out the IDER. We also wanted to make that shift in terms of, get away from the passive learning and go to the active learning. The feedback that we felt that were on the IDERs were not always timely. The quality of the feedback may not be what we were looking for. And the staff are happy. Staff are really happy that they don't need to do the IDERs anymore. And then when you look at when you're starting your program in CBD, you're adding new work, you're adding more work. So when you do that, you may want to take something away. And that's why we decided to take the IDERs away. The only time that we would use an IDER is when the residents are on off service because we were not sure how that it would go with the ETAs. And when we started, most of the the other programs were not familiar yet with ETAs. So instead of using an either, we are also using a type of narrative feedback, which is normally fulfilled by the CTU director at the end of the rotation. And this is what replaces the either. Next slide. So next, I wanted to speak around how did we get to giving a 5. That seems to be quite of a problem. So prior to the start of CBD of 2017, we did a little research project where we created a new form to evaluate the surgery. And new slide. First, we kind of looked at, well, what would be the ideal tool to use in the operating room? It had to be something that you reflects your EPAs and milestones, easy to complete, obviously formative, had to have a global rating scale of entrustment. We wanted to have a description of the stepwise of specific surgeries. And we wanted also some room where it will allow to see the residents that are included. Next slide. So we came up with what's called a formative surgical evaluation tool. And on that tool, we took all the surgeries. Well, actually, we did it for about 12 surgeries. And we break down the important steps of the surgery. So if we look on the left-hand side of the first table, we have a short description of part of the surgery. And instead of using a score 1 to 5, we put some descriptive of what we were looking for each of those specific steps of the surgery. And in terms of the narrative feedback, we were asking our staff to give at least one specific suggestion on where the resident needs to continue working on. And then our global rating scale, we actually took the adapted O score and came up with a scale 1 to 5. For the 4, we called it that they were able to perform with minimal supervision. And then for the 5, we said that they were able to perform without supervision, basically that they were independent. So we took all of these different surgeries, passed it on through the OR, and within a year, we collected the data about those forms. So new slide. So we ended up having 92 forms completed in various surgeries. New slide. And one of the things that we wanted to verify is we wanted to verify 2 things. So we wanted to verify along the checklist of the scores if there was any meaningful difference in between the junior residents and the senior residents. And it concluded that yes, we could see that the mean score on the senior residents was much better than the junior score as expected. New slide. And then we did see the same thing that for the global rating entrustment score, senior residents performed better than the junior residents. Next slide. And then finally, after that study, we looked at the quality feedback. We collected all of that feedback through residents and staff throughout the phone. They really liked the form. They felt that it was an immediate feedback, on the spot. It generated a good discussion in, 2 ways, so through the residents and the staff. It was easy and quick to complete, but then they kind of felt that it would be good if we could have a more functional online platform. Obviously, this was done on paper for that study. So new slide. So the end product of that study was that we felt that it was a great aid for the transition into CBD, as this was done in the year of 2016, which brought our faculty ready to launch, CBD in July, and being familiar with similar forms that they would have to do on the Royal College main course. Next slide. So I wanted to come up a little bit with that Entrustment Global Rating Scale for competency. We are probably the only program that kind of started on main court in 2017. And one of the problem was the grade number 5. It says like I didn't need to be there. And the 4 was, well, I needed to be there just in case. The problem was that in surgery, we always need to be in the operating room most of the time. I mean, it is what's expected from us. And our staff had a hard time to, say, well, okay, hard to put a 5 for that. Over time, things got better, and we kind of like rationalized that, okay, we know that we can't not be there, but how about we pretend not to be there? To help with all of this, MedSys group came up with some new descriptors for the 4 and the 5, and this has been implemented this year. And the 4 now says that I had to provide minor direction, and the 5 says that I did not need to provide direction for safe and independent care as for the 5. Next slide. So the issues with giving a 5 in surgery, as I just previously mentioned, surgeons are required to be in the operating room. And when we started, we kind of like, well, let's pretend that we're in the hallway, even if we're in there. In a sense that you can still be in the operating room and only watching, trying to only provide direction if you're obliged. Obviously, there's some surgeries that you need to assist. So when you assist, your resident will be primary surgeon. And as you're assisting, you would provide feedback only if necessary. When you are in solo surgery, the staff would be watching on a video monitor. So, resident can still be independent, and you can still provide some feedback by watching on the monitor. And of course, we can use also simulation. But one of the problems that we noticed is for shorter surgeries, we are able to, pretty much let a resident do from A to B and to C to Z and finish. But when we're starting to looking at these long, more complex surgeries that our residents still need to be competent, this is a bit of one of our problems. Once you're trying to fill out an EPA on a specific surgery that's fairly long, residents don't have a chance to do all the steps of the surgery. So what we are hoping is that we can implement on MedSys to try to break up each of those long surgeries on the smaller steps, and that hopefully that, when the resident comes, they can choose some of the steps of the surgeries. And once you tabulate all the results, they end up doing a full surgery that's assessed by, only looking at part of the surgery. New slide. So I'm almost finished, but can we go to the new slide? Thank you. So what we noticed on one of the things about the grade 4 and the grade 5. So on the weekend, I did a tabulation of all of those ratings, 4 and 5. And one of my issues, or I would say probably more, I was a bit worried, was what happens when the residents are on off service versus on service. And basically, when we did a calculation of the EPAs, we did not find any difference. We felt that even now when they are on the off service rotation, that the staff are actually just as comfortable as we are as rating a 5. New slide. And then the last thing that I did look at is I separated, because as you know, EPAs has a clinical part and a surgical part. And what I noticed is when I'm looking at the difference in terms of the rating 4 and 5, is that residents are more likely on getting 5s on clinical EPAs rather than surgical EPAs. Next slide. So in conclusion, with the issue with the descriptors, it may imply that either we are not great at giving 5s at procedures, which may be true, or it is more intrinsically difficult to be independent on procedures rather than clinical scenarios. So moving forward, surgical specialties may need to be careful on procedural evaluation. Perhaps an appropriate orientation could resolve the issues if they want to only use 5 as a pass. Next slide. Oh, I'm done. Any questions?
Oh, Parveen, I can see that you're speaking, but you're muted.
Thanks, Diane. So for the 3 presentations for Island and Lori and Diane, I think if people have questions, you guys can maybe chat offline. That would be great. Or you can put it now in the chat box. And but we're going to move on to our next presentation, and that's Aline. We have 2 more. Hopefully we can wrap this up by maybe about 5 after 5, I think, not to cut anybody's time short. So Aline, academic half-day redesign and boot camps. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll probably be a little bit quicker than 10 minutes. So one of the things that we had looked at when we were transitioning to CBD is our academic half-day curriculum. Historically, we used to go through the core eMERGE textbook, mostly medical expert, over a 2-year period, repeated 2.5 times over the course of training, 1 lecture per chapter. And it was done as a large group. So all of our residents were together. So like our PGY 1s all the way to PGY 5s. We actually did a fairly comprehensive relook at that right before we switched over to CBD to see if there was a better way that we could roll out our curriculum. And so we removed a number of things that could be done easily at home, focused on topics that were better served in person, designed some senior and junior objectives for each session, along with resources that included textbooks, journal articles, along with a number of FOMED resources as well. And then spent a fair amount of time encouraging our faculty to look at non-purely didactic teaching, so things like flipped classroom or case-based learning, et cetera. As you go to the next slide, what one of our residents did is their education project was they went through and they sort of developed objectives for both the senior and junior trainees, along with sort of what the resources were that residents could then use. And the biggest things is that, what were the specific objectives of training, what were the different types of presentation styles available, and then the different resources. So in addition to sort of our standard eMERGE textbooks, where else could people go looking for resources? If you go on to the next slide again. So we also did the same thing for our intrinsic competencies. And so we layered our intrinsic curriculum over top of our blocks, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, where we have, so when we're talking about our resuscitation block, we would talk about end-of-life care, end-of-life conversations, palliative care. We would touch on it in that block as well, because we thought that was a good and opportune place for us to talk about it. And go on to the next slide again. And so the pink boxes at the top, I know you can't read it, so you don't have to try, but the pink core curriculum on the top, as well as the intrinsic roles, which are in yellow, do still run over a couple of years. And we do those in the mornings of our academic half days. For Thursday afternoons, we do divide our residents into different stages or years, sort of depending on which group we're looking at. And it tends to be more stage and year specific. And then we also run a number of in-training exams to help the residents keep track of where they are. And then we also run a number of things that aren't sort of on an annual basis. So for example, we run a critical care day every other year, a procedure day for sort of those high acuity, low occurrence events. And then we run a disaster day every couple of years as well, where we run a mock mass casualty. And finally, we run like a POCUS course every couple of years. Those tend to be a fairly high, a lot of resources go into them, and so we can only run them every 2 years, but they're all fairly well reviewed. If you go on to the next slide. The other thing that we've done is we've developed a set of boot camps at the major transitions of residency training. So early in PGY1, in addition to our regular academic half day, we run a number of sessions to help our just starting residents how to manage emergencies, both in the emergency department, but also when they are off service on other rotations, about how would they manage a call for shortness of breath, or a call for chest pain, or a call for fever on the ward when they're not in the emergency department. So we do that right at the beginning to help transition them into residency. About halfway through their first year, when they're back on emerge, we do a research boot camp to talk about critical appraisal, how to do different types of research projects, and how to do a quality assurance project. In PGY2, when they're back on emerge, we run a communicator collaborator boot camp, along with doing our junior simulation curriculum, our EMS curriculum, and a number of other curriculums that sort of run in parallel over the course of the year. Before they transition into their critical care year, so when they're off service in PGY3 doing a lot of their critical care rotations, we talk about a number of critical care skills so that they're ready when they start their ICU and CCU blocks. In their second core year, or their fourth year right before they write the exam, we often talk a lot about how to teach in groups, how to teach on the fly in the emergency department, how to do good handover, how to break bad news effectively, and then run our senior simulation curriculum in that year. And then in our transition to practice year, we talk a lot about transition to practice topics. So for example, billing, finances, about academia, if they're going to be going into an academic location, and then some of the administrative aspects of practice in general, as well as practice in the emergency department. You can go on to the next slide. So our academic half-day curriculum looks like this. So thank God for my PA and my APD who can keep track of all of this. So one of the things that we found is it's actually been very highly rated, and it's sort of an iterative process where we're taking feedback from our residents on an annual basis and then modifying things moving forward. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alima. I'm thinking is that we've had some great talks, is that I think a lot of them actually could be expanded. So I'm thinking from Diane's perspective, the 4 to 5 shift would be really useful to present to the surgical program directors as how to get their faculty, and then for the EIDers. So same with academic curriculum. I mean, that's really fantastic what you've done. And it may be an opportunity for, and it's really not CBME focused. It's actually really about program, is to take that further. So program directors are interested in how to have that kind of academic curriculum run through their program according to context. That might be useful to expand all of these to some training, some educational sessions. So that's great. Thank you. And then again, along that same vein, we have Daniel Brandt Vegas and Leslie Martin and Siraj and Marie and Jonathan Sherbino. But Daniel and Leslie are going to be talking about a program evaluation strategy toolkit for residency training programs. And I think I just want to emphasize that these last 2 talks really is very important from a program across whether you're CBME, or whether you're a traditional based program, or obviously for most of us both. So go ahead. I don't know which Dan or Leslie, I'm not sure.
Yeah, thanks, Praveen. It's Dana here. Yeah, great. Yeah, if you want to maybe just stop there. Oh, okay. So we've heard a lot about how implementing CBME and kind of changing the way our programs do things from a curricular point of view, an assessment point of view. And I think what we've kind of put forth is the question of how do we know if these changes are working? And how do we know what kind of impact these changes are having across the program and other parts of it? So if you can click. We looked at some of the issues that our program, internal medicine specifically, was facing, and this is CBME related as well as beyond CBME. But From an evaluation point of view, an evaluation as in measuring metrics that are important to the program to know how the program is doing. And this is related to accreditation, but beyond as well, as an internal and kind of strategic planning exercise. We realized that there was limited stakeholder input. We realized that it was kind of patchy, mostly based on our rotations. That was the most sort of systematic aspect of gathering data about the program. But a lot of it was kind of based on crises and opinions and things that came up, and it was largely reactive. And what we thought we wanted to transition, if you can click twice, was towards kind of a model that would include, would be plural, would be systematic, would be aspirational rather than reactive. And basically we would gather data in a systematic, comprehensive way involving all important stakeholders, and then we'd analyze that data systematically to then have sort of strengths and weaknesses and sort of a strategic planning. If you can click twice. So we thought that what we're striving kind of is to create that type of model where the data is robust, where we can act on data at a short and midterm kind of interval, but that we could also have a comprehensive periodic report that that it would sort of be ahead of the curve in terms of accreditation, and not just sort of waiting until we have accreditation come and then start kind of running around and trying to address things either before, right before accreditation, or then afterwards when they've been identified as issues. And if you could click twice, we realized that there's sort of a cost to doing this, and we quickly kind of predict that, you know, from a personnel or human resource point of view, you're going to have people in charge of this, and both from a scholarly and kind of evaluation role to oversee it and plan it, and then analyze the data, but then also someone who is willing and able to collect the data. And then from a time point of view, in terms of putting the time in to plan for this and then eventually analyze the data. Next slide, please. So I guess what we thought to be able to do this was, we've come up with this way of creating a blueprint for evaluation. And to walk you through of what that blueprint looks like, we basically started out with a similar exercise than what most people here have done as curriculum mapping for a curriculum design or for an assessment approach to your program. And I think most people here have either done it or will be doing it soon for your EPAs to know where your learners will get the EPAs in your program. But this was different in that it was breaking down the program from an evaluation perspective. So if you could click twice more, yeah, again, okay. So we broke the program into its different components. And so the components of the program could be any part of the program that we think is sort of a meaningful kind of a nugget of the program, whether it be the rotations, whether it be the assessment, whether it be different administrative components, different committees. And so trying to be comprehensive to really include everything that we thought might be important or relevant. If you could click, good, yep. So each component then we broke down into processes. So what are the processes for each of those components that actually characterize the function of that component? So what are different things that happen in order for that to function? If you can click again, you'll see that our next kind of idea was then to come up with measurable and relevant outcomes for each of those processes. So we went from that general program kind of big view down to the more granular sort of outcome level. And again, focusing on outcomes that are important, that are measurable. And then for each outcome, if you can click a few more times, what we look to kind of include, and yeah, you might want to stop there, was to come up with all the different stakeholders that each outcome would be relevant to. So when we measure that outcome, we are inclusive and plural, and we're measuring not in a single group, but rather across different perspectives and experiences. And so I'm going to show you in the next slide kind of what the blank version of this looks like. And so we call this the grid for evaluation operationalization, or the GEO. And so it's essentially you have your program components, and then, you know, next to each component, it would be broken down in processes, and then for each process, the outcomes, and then for each outcomes, the stakeholders. There's a few other kind of columns that we added that we won't get into for the sake of time and complexity, but I'll show you, if you can click again. We're going to focus on this one row of assessment, and I'm going to show you what that looks like once we actually put in the different processes, and then the outcomes, and then the stakeholders for that one row in terms of the data we want to collect, analyze, and then use moving forward from an evaluation perspective. So let's go to the next slide. So here we have only that one assessment program component. So you can imagine there's about 20-something program components for the internal medicine program. And for this one assessment component, we have all these different processes that go from the IDARs, the EPAs, the frequency and quality of the feedback, the OSCE, the knowledge exam that we have, and then formative assessments that exist for non-clinical activity. And we came up with individual outcomes for each of those processes. As you can see there, if you look at IDARs, there's 4 different outcomes that we thought would be relevant. And then we kind of estimated what a frequency of measurement would be kind of feasible and helpful, and then what stakeholder groups we would want to actually include here. Now, again, I've kind of walked you through this process, and it probably seems slightly overwhelming when you think of building a table like this. If there's, you know, this is probably a particularly robust program component assessment, but it's not the only one like this, and it is actually quite labor intensive. So what we're actually planning on doing now is putting this whole activity into a pretty user-friendly and straightforward software that any program can then use, that would basically walk your program through different screens with menus, and you would basically just click what applies to your program, and it would kind of auto-populate. So by the end of this sort of tick box screen exercise, you would end up with your program specific grid for evaluation operationalization that would kind of help you map out and eventually carry out an evaluation strategy that would be comprehensive, scholarly, and that would kind of put you in a position to identify areas to do QI projects on and improve, as well as kind of be not only prepared, but also kind of very much in sync with accreditation from the Royal College, as well as any internal accreditation.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dan. We do have maybe 1 or 2 minutes if anybody has a comment.
Yeah, for sure.
Anybody have a comment or question?
I could probably ask it offline, but I'd be curious more about the software, Dan. We can maybe look at it at the Program Evaluation Committee. That's curious.
Yeah, we can talk more about that. I mean, the idea is it's something that we're looking to develop. Again, sort of a desktop type software, something that people could just kind of open up. It would live in the program's computer, and basically would be sort of a walk-in to design specific programs evaluation strategy, where they would end up with sort of some resources and a clear plan on kind of what to do moving forward. And that's the idea. We'll have hopefully something tangible in the next little while to kind of showcase.
Wonderful.
That's great. And Irene, definitely. So what Irene's saying, amazing initiatives are ripe for scholarship. And I think that's going to be a huge plan for Daniel as well, in terms of, I think you're already going to present this and write this up. So that's just great. So thank you, everybody. I think it's been great. I wish we had more time. We could easily make this an entire day. Maybe we will. So want to thank everybody, thank all the speakers, thank our facilitators from the morning. It's been a great 3-day webinar or 3 webinar series. Really, again, want to thank the planning committee and obviously Lisa and Allison, who've done a great job of putting it all together. I think all of us collectively have learned a lot. And I think, one of the things for this morning, the first hour is really, that was actually very easy to set up, is that we should continue on that as people coming together, having ideas. I think the best place for people to learn is actually from each other and from lived in experiences. And that has been exceptionally helpful. And then for the second hour, I think every single one of them could be expanded. I won't be calling, I'll be calling upon each of the speakers, but is to kind of really expand the topic. So as we get ready for accreditation, because a lot of them are about the entire program as well as CBME. So thanks to all of you and have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.